On the night of April 19th, a nearly 900-foot Iranian-flagged cargo ship called the Touska was moving through the Gulf of Oman when the American guided missile destroyer USS Spruance ordered it to stop. According to U.S. Central Command, the warnings went on for 6 straight hours. The Touska kept moving anyway, so the Spruance disabled it, according to the president's own description, by putting a hole directly into the engine room, and United States Marines boarded the vessel and took custody of it and everyone on board. That single interception, confirmed by CENTCOM as a deliberate, professional, and proportional action to enforce an active naval blockade, set off one of the most consequential and most self-defeating chains of events in this entire war. Because 3 days later, Iran responded in a way that ended up costing it far more than anything it gained. To understand why that single boarding action mattered so much, you have to understand exactly what kind of blockade the Touska was trying to slip past in the first place. This wasn't some improvised, loosely enforced restriction. It was a formally declared American naval operation, backed by warships actively patrolling one of the busiest and most strategically vital waterways on the planet, specifically designed to choke off Iran's ability to move oil and goods in and out of its own ports until Tehran came back to the negotiating table with something Washington considered a serious offer. Every ship that successfully evaded that blockade represented a small but real crack in the pressure campaign, and every ship that got caught, like the Touska, became a very public demonstration that the blockade actually had teeth. That's exactly why the seizure landed with as much weight as it did, both as a genuine tactical setback for Iran's efforts to keep some trade moving, and as a symbolic moment that Iranian leadership clearly felt compelled to respond to, regardless of how counterproductive that response would ultimately prove to be once the full picture came into view over the following weeks. Here's the sequence, laid out exactly as it happened, because the timing here is the entire story and every detail of it matters for understanding what came next. On April 13th, the United States formally imposed a naval blockade on Iranian ports after an earlier round of talks in Islamabad collapsed, without producing a deal. Just 4 days later, on April 17th, Iran announced it was pausing its own closure of the Strait of Hormuz, a closure that had actually been in effect since the war first broke out back on February 28th, saying the strait would now be completely open to commercial traffic for the duration of a separate truce holding in Lebanon. That lasted exactly 1 day. On April 18th, Iran reversed course and closed the strait again, citing the continued American blockade of its own ports as justification. And that back and forth, open 1 day, closed the next, is exactly the environment the Touska sailed into when it tried to slip past the blockade on the 19th. Stick around, because we're going to walk through exactly what happened after that seizure, why Iran's retaliation just 72 hours later turned out to be one of the worst timed decisions of the entire conflict, what the international community actually said about it, and how this single moment of escalation helped set the stage for months of continued warfare that followed. If you're finding value in this kind of detailed, fact-based breakdown, go ahead and drop a like. It genuinely helps this kind of coverage reach more people trying to actually understand the sequence of events instead of just catching fragments of headlines, and subscribe if you haven't already, because this conflict keeps producing exactly this kind of consequential, underreported moment. Following the Touska seizure, Iran's Joint Military Command didn't waste any time responding publicly, immediately calling the interception an act of piracy and vowing that Iran's armed forces would soon respond. That threat landed at an already tense moment because President Trump had also just accused Tehran of what he called a total violation of the ceasefire after Iranian forces reportedly fired on ships near the Strait of Hormuz that same Saturday. Trump posted about it directly, writing that Iran had decided to fire bullets in the strait, calling it a total violation of the ceasefire agreement, and warning that unless Iran agreed to a deal, the United States would knock out every single power plant and every single bridge in Iran. That threat, which would later become the foundation for the actual infrastructure targeting doctrine carried out over the following months, was already being floated as a real possibility at this exact moment in April. It's worth pausing on just how significant that threat actually was, even though at the time it may have read as just another piece of characteristically blunt rhetoric from an already heated exchange. Threatening to destroy a country's bridges and power infrastructure as a matter of formal policy, rather than as an isolated tactical decision made in the middle of an active battle, represents a fundamentally different kind of warning than most of what had been exchanged between the two sides up to that point. It signaled that the conflict was already being reframed, at least in Washington's messaging, away from purely military targets like missile bunkers and drone storage, and toward the kind of civilian-facing infrastructure that touches ordinary people's daily lives far more directly. That reframing didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened specifically in response to Iran's continued willingness to fire on ships and defy the blockade, which means the roots of the infrastructure campaign that eventually reshaped entire coastal cities trace directly back to this exact moment in the conflict. Despite all of that tension, there was still a genuine diplomatic track alive at the same time. Vice President J.D. Vance, Special Envoy Steve Witkoff, and Trump's son-in-law Jared Kushner were reportedly preparing to travel to Islamabad, Pakistan, for a new round of negotiations with Iranian representatives. But Iran's foreign ministry, in the immediate aftermath of the Touska seizure, said plainly that no decision had been made yet on whether Tehran would even participate. That's the state of play heading into the weekend of April 22nd, a fragile, half-functioning diplomatic process sitting right next to an active blockade, an active ship seizure, and threats of infrastructure strikes hanging over everything. And then, late on April 21st, President Trump made a genuinely conciliatory move that stood out against the backdrop of everything else happening that same weekend. He announced he was extending the ceasefire with Iran indefinitely, explicitly giving Iranian leadership time, in his words, to come up with a unified proposal. That's a real diplomatic gesture, an American president voluntarily removing a deadline that had been hanging over the negotiations and creating space for Iran's government, which had been dealing with its own internal divisions throughout this process, to actually get its position together. The catch, and it was an important one, was that the naval blockade itself would continue regardless of the ceasefire extension. Trump was giving Iran room to negotiate, but he wasn't giving up the economic pressure that was already squeezing the regime. Here's where this story turns into exactly the kind of self-inflicted wound the title of this video is pointing at. And it's worth slowing down here because every detail of what happened next matters. Just hours after that ceasefire extension was announced, Iran's Revolutionary Guard attacked 3 commercial ships in the Strait of Hormuz and seized 2 of them outright. The vessels involved were the MSC Francesca, a Panamanian-flagged Italian-owned container ship, and another vessel called the Epaminondas. Neither ship had any connection to the United States or Israel. These were international commercial vessels going about ordinary business in one of the most important shipping corridors on the planet, and Iran's forces boarded and seized them within hours of the American president extending an olive branch specifically designed to give Tehran room to negotiate in good faith, a sequence of events that, once fully laid out, looks less like coincidence and more like a genuine failure of judgment at the worst possible moment. The international reaction came almost immediately, and it wasn't sympathetic to Iran's position in the slightest. Panama's foreign ministry, representing the flag state of the seized MSC Francesca, issued a formal statement condemning the seizure as a grave attack against maritime security. The statement went further, explicitly describing the action as contrary to international law and calling it an unnecessary escalation happening at a moment when the broader international community was actively advocating for the Strait of Hormuz to remain open to navigation without threats or blackmail of any kind. That's about as blunt a rebuke as one government issues against another in formal diplomatic language, and it came from Panama, a country with no direct stake in the broader American-Iranian conflict, simply reacting as the flag state of a ship that had just been seized for no reason connected to the actual war Iran was fighting, which is exactly what made the statement land with as much credibility as it did internationally. The White House response was notable for what it didn't say just as much as for what it did. When asked directly whether the administration considered Iran's seizure of 2 international vessels to be a violation of the ceasefire Trump had just extended, the White House press secretary said no, specifically because these were not American ships and not Israeli ships, just 2 international vessels caught in the middle. That's a technically accurate answer, but it also reveals something important about how this entire episode played out strategically for Iran. By seizing ships with no American or Israeli ownership, Iran managed to avoid triggering an immediate, direct military response tied to the ceasefire violation clause specifically. But in doing so, it also failed to achieve whatever leverage it might have been hoping to gain, because the ships it grabbed didn't actually put pressure on Washington in any meaningful way. Instead, all it did was alienate a completely unrelated third country, Panama, along with the broader international shipping community that depends on predictable, rules-based passage through exactly this kind of choke point. Beyond the direct diplomatic and a government-to-government fallout, this episode also sent a chill through the broader commercial shipping industry that depends on predictable conditions in exactly this kind of waterway to function at all. Maritime insurers, who price risk into every voyage through contested waters, responded to this specific pattern of seizures by pushing war risk premiums for vessels transiting the Strait of Hormuz sharply higher, adding real cost to every shipment moving through the corridor regardless of which flag it sailed under or which country it was actually headed to or from. Major shipping alliances and individual carriers began quietly rerouting where possible, even though the alternative paths around the Arabian Peninsula add significant time and fuel costs to any voyage, cutting directly into already thin margins across an industry still recovering from years of disruption tied to unrelated conflicts elsewhere in the region. That kind of behavioral shift among shipping companies doesn't reverse itself quickly, once trust in a waterway's safety has been damaged, And every additional seizure, especially one as clearly disconnected from any legitimate enforcement rationale as the MSC Francesca and Epaminondas boardings were, reinforces exactly the kind of risk perception that keeps those premiums elevated, and that keeps global shipping companies treating the Strait as fundamentally less reliable than it was before this war began. That press briefing also included another detail that's easy to miss but genuinely important for understanding where the pressure campaign against Iran was actually headed. The press secretary noted that it remained very important to the president to get Iran's stockpile of enriched uranium out of the country entirely, stating plainly that Iran needed to turn over that material. That demand, sitting right alongside the ship seizure story, is a reminder that the maritime standoff in the Strait was never actually the core issue driving this conflict. It was always downstream of the much bigger fight over Iran's nuclear program, the same fight that would eventually lead to threats against sites like Pickaxe Mountain months later. Every ship seized, every blockade extended, every bridge threatened, all of it functioned as leverage in service of that one underlying demand. And Iran's decision to seize 2 unrelated commercial vessels, right after receiving a diplomatic gesture, did nothing to advance its position on the actual issue Washington cared most about, which was and remains the disposition of that uranium stockpile rather than the fate of any individual cargo ship. Let's talk about why this specific decision genuinely qualifies as an immediate regret, rather than just another exchange in an already long-running conflict. Timing and diplomacy matters enormously, arguably as much as substance does. When one side extends a good faith gesture, removing a deadline, offering more time, signaling flexibility, the expected response, if the other side actually wants a deal, is to use that space productively, to quietly work toward the unified proposal that was specifically requested, or at minimum to avoid any new provocations that could hand the other side justification to reverse course. Iran did the opposite. It took the exact moment when it had just been given more room to maneuver and used it to seize 2 ships belonging to completely uninvolved third parties, generating international condemnation, undercutting its own claim to being a reasonable actor seeking a negotiated resolution, and handing Washington every justification it needed to keep the blockade running exactly as planned, since nothing about the ceasefire extension had actually required lifting it in the first place. Think about it from a pure negotiating theory perspective for a moment, because the strategic logic here really doesn't add up in Iran's favor, no matter how you look at it. If the goal was to demonstrate continued capability and resolve, Iran had already done that repeatedly throughout this conflict through direct military exchanges, missile launches, and confrontations tied clearly to the actual war effort. Seizing 2 unrelated commercial vessels added nothing new to that demonstration of capability, since nobody seriously doubted Iran retained the ability to interdict shipping in its own territorial waters. If the goal was instead to create leverage heading into the Islamabad talks, the seizure accomplished the opposite, because it gave Washington a fresh, internationally condemned example of exactly the kind of behavior that justifies continued pressure rather than concessions. And if the goal was purely domestic messaging, proving to hardliners at home that the regime hadn't gone soft, that's the one interpretation that actually holds up. But it came at a cost that, as the following weeks would demonstrate through billions of dollars in lost oil revenue and a formal diplomatic rebuke from an entirely uninvolved third country, vastly outweighed whatever short-term domestic political benefit it might have provided. The financial cost of that miscalculation piled up fast. By April 22nd, President Trump was already claiming the blockade had cost Iran $500 million a day in lost trade and revenue. By May 1st, just over a week later, the Department of Defense had put a formal number on the cumulative damage, estimating Iran had lost $4.8 billion in oil revenue since the blockade began. Those are staggering figures for any economy to absorb, let alone one already under significant strain from years of sanctions, and every day that Iran's own actions gave Washington additional justification to keep that blockade in place was another day added to that total. Over the following weeks, CENTCOM would report intercepting 85 vessels attempting to move through the blockade, with 3 ships ultimately seized outright, and Iran seizing 2 cargo ships of its own in retaliation, a pattern of tit-for-tat maritime confrontation that ground on for weeks after this initial exchange, all while Iran's oil revenue kept bleeding out at a rate the country simply couldn't sustain indefinitely. Put those numbers in perspective for a second, because the scale of it is easy to skim past when you're just hearing dollar figures rather than thinking through what they actually represent for a country already stretched thin on every front. $4.8 billion in lost oil revenue over roughly 2.5 weeks works out to an economy hemorrhaging money at a pace that would strain even a wealthy, diversified national budget, let alone one already stretched thin by years of international sanctions, and by that point, months of active warfare on top of it. Oil revenue isn't just abstract government income either. It's the primary funding source behind everything from the country's missile program to the security apparatus responsible for suppressing domestic unrest. which means every dollar lost to the blockade represents a dollar. The regime doesn't have available for exactly the priorities it cares most about protecting. Shipping industry analysts tracking vessel movement through the strait throughout this period noted that even as some traffic continued finding ways around the disruption, 26 vessels reportedly managing to bypass the blockade entirely according to Lloyd's List data, the overwhelming majority of normal commercial activity through one of the world's most important waterways had simply stopped. And that kind of sustained disruption doesn't get undone quickly, even once a blockade is eventually lifted, because shipping companies and insurers factor risk premiums into their routing decisions for months or years after a crisis like this one finally resolves. It's worth stepping back and putting this specific episode into the broader pattern of how Iran has handled ship seizures throughout the years, because this wasn't a new or unusual tactic being tried for the first time. Iran has a long, well-documented history of seizing tankers and cargo vessels passing through the Strait of Hormuz, often justifying the seizures with claims about smuggled fuel or violations of maritime law that are difficult for outside observers to independently verify. Back in 2019, the West accused Iran of a series of limpet mine attacks on tankers moving through the strait. In 2021, a drone attack linked to Iran struck an Israeli-connected oil tanker, killing 2 crew members. In May of 2022, Iran seized 2 Greek tankers and held them for 6 months before finally releasing them that November. In April of 2024, Iran seized a Portuguese-flagged cargo ship called the MSC Ares. And earlier this year, in February, just before this current war even began, Iran seized 2 additional foreign oil tankers near Farsi Island, accusing them of smuggling roughly 1 million liters of fuel and detaining 15 foreign crew members just 1 day before scheduled talks with the United States and Oman. That last example from February is worth sitting with for a moment because it establishes that this exact playbook, seizing vessels right on the eve of or immediately following a significant diplomatic moment, wasn't invented in April. It was already a demonstrated pattern before this current war had even fully begun. Seizing tankers the day before high-stakes talks in Oman sends a very particular signal, one that says Iran intends to walk into negotiations, having already demonstrated leverage and control over the waterway, regardless of how that demonstration might be perceived by the country sitting across the table. Whether that strategy has ever actually produced better negotiating outcomes for Iran across any of these episodes stretching back years is a genuinely open question. And the accumulating evidence from this current war, this specific April episode chief among it, suggests the answer is very likely no matter how many times the tactic gets reached for again. That pattern matters because it shows this specific April episode wasn't some uncharacteristic overreach born out of confusion in the heat of an active war. It was Iran reaching for a tactic it has used repeatedly over the years, treating ship seizures as a relatively low-cost way to project strength, generate leverage, or simply demonstrate that it still controls activity within its own territorial waters, regardless of what an American naval blockade is doing outside of them. What made this particular instance different, and what made the timing such a genuine strategic error, was the specific diplomatic context surrounding it. Seizing tankers over alleged smuggling violations during ordinary peacetime tension is one thing. Seizing 2 unrelated international vessels within hours of receiving an explicit public diplomatic concession from the country you're actively negotiating a ceasefire with is a completely different kind of decision. One that reads far less like routine enforcement and far more like a government either testing limits it shouldn't have tested or simply failing to coordinate its military actions with its own diplomatic messaging in the middle of an active, high-stakes negotiation. There's also a fair and honest counterpoint worth including here, because it would be incomplete to present this purely as Iran acting irrationally without any underlying logic at all. From Tehran's perspective, the blockade itself was already inflicting enormous economic pain, and Iranian leadership may have calculated that some form of visible retaliation was necessary domestically, regardless of the diplomatic optics, simply to demonstrate to its own population and to hardline factions within its own government that the country wasn't simply absorbing pressure without pushing back in some way. Authoritarian governments facing this kind of squeeze often need to show strength internally, even when doing so damages their position externally, precisely because the internal political cost of appearing passive can outweigh the external diplomatic cost of appearing aggressive, at least in the calculation of leaders more worried about maintaining domestic control than about international reputation. That's a real dynamic, and it's worth acknowledging even while recognizing that whatever the underlying domestic logic might have been, the external consequences of this specific decision were almost uniformly negative for Iran's actual negotiating position. It's also worth considering how state media inside Iran actually covered this episode, because the domestic framing tells you something important about what the leadership was hoping to accomplish. Rather than treating the seizures as a minor tactical footnote, Iranian state outlets presented the boarding of the 2 vessels as proof that the Revolutionary Guard remained firmly in control of the waterway, despite the American blockade, framing it explicitly as a show of continued sovereignty rather than as retaliation tied to any specific grievance. That framing makes considerably more sense as a message aimed inward at an Iranian public and an Iranian political establishment increasingly anxious about the toll this war was taking than as a message aimed outward at Washington or at the broader international community. If that reading is accurate, it suggests Iranian leadership may have genuinely understood the external diplomatic cost of the seizure going in, and decided that cost was still worth paying in order to shore up its own domestic standing, at a moment when the war was already testing the regime's grip on public confidence in ways that mattered more to its survival than anything happening at the negotiating table in Islamabad, even if that same decision made reaching an actual deal at that table measurably harder in the weeks that followed. What makes this episode worth revisiting months later, rather than treating it as just one more skirmish lost in the broader timeline of this conflict, is how directly it connects to everything that followed. The blockade that Iran's seizure helped justify extending didn't get lifted in the following weeks. It continued grinding down Iranian oil revenue for months, laying the economic groundwork for exactly the kind of desperate, cornered negotiating posture we've seen from Tehran ever since. The infrastructure threats Trump made that same weekend, promising to knock out every power plant and every bridge in Iran, didn't stay theoretical either. They became the actual operational doctrine carried out in the months that followed, striking bridges near Bandar Abbas, hitting communications towers and a desalination plant, and eventually expanding the target list toward Tehran itself. In the broader cycle of escalation that this specific weekend represents, diplomatic gesture met with provocation, provocation met with continued pressure met with more Iranian escalation, has essentially defined the entire shape of this war ever since, repeating itself in slightly different forms through the ceasefire and resumption in late June, through the renewed strikes that began at the end of February, and right up through the current standoff over whether Iran is genuinely willing to negotiate at all. Look at where things stand today, months after that April episode, and the through line becomes impossible to miss. Iran is still fighting a war. It's been losing ground and militarily, night after night. Its economy is still being strangled by a blockade that traces its continued justification directly back to moments like this one, when Iran's own actions handed Washington every reason it needed to keep the pressure on, rather than ease it. And the trust deficit between the two sides, the same deficit that makes any current negotiation so difficult to close, was measurably deepened by exactly this kind of episode, a government extending a good faith gesture only to watch it get answered within hours by an action that undermined the entire spirit of what had just been offered. Diplomacy, more than almost anything else in international relations, runs on a kind of accumulated trust built through a series of reciprocal signals over time. Every time one side extends something in good faith and the other side responds with an unrelated provocation, that trust account gets drained a little further, and eventually, as we've seen play out over the following months, there's simply not enough of it left to close a deal even when both sides claim, publicly, that they'd prefer one. It's worth tracing that thread all the way forward to understand just how directly this one weekend in April connects to everything that's happened since, because it's rare in a conflict this complex to find a single, clearly documented moment that explains so much of what followed. The blockade that continued past this episode kept squeezing Iran's economy straight through May, eventually feeding into the same financial desperation that shaped Iran's posture heading into the brief ceasefire that held for much of June, before that ceasefire itself broke down and the war resumed at the end of that month with even greater intensity than before. The bridges and power plant doctrine, first threatened in the Exact Truth social post responding to this same weekend's escalation, became fully operational by July, striking real infrastructure in Bandar Abbas and beyond, with all the humanitarian and legal controversy that followed. And the deep well of mutual distrust that made this specific ceasefire extension backfire so badly is the same well of mutual distrust that's still poisoning the current negotiations happening right now, with Iran's own foreign ministry recently insisting there are no active talks underway at all, and that Tehran will never allow Washington to dictate the timing of war and peace. None of that is coincidental. It's a direct, traceable line running from a single weekend of miscalculated escalation all the way through to the stalled, exhausted standoff the two countries find themselves in today. That's really the lasting lesson buried inside this specific episode, more than just the raw financial cost or the diplomatic embarrassment of a formal rebuke from Panama's foreign ministry. Iran seized two ships it had no real strategic reason to seize at precisely the moment it had the least reason to do so, and in acting on what may have been an entirely understandable domestic political impulse to appear strong rather than passive, it likely cost itself far more in credibility, in continued economic pain, and in the deepening mistrust that's continued shaping this conflict ever since than it could have possibly gained from holding two unrelated commercial vessels for a matter of days. Whether Iranian leadership has genuinely absorbed that lesson going into the current round of stalled negotiations is an open question. But the pattern of behavior we've continued watching throughout this war, the repeated cycle of provocation immediately following any diplomatic opening, suggests the instinct to reach for exactly this kind of short-term show of strength hasn't gone away, even after watching it backfire this badly just a few months ago. What do you think this specific episode tells us about how Iran's leadership actually makes decisions in moments of genuine diplomatic opportunity? Do you think this was a calculated domestic political move that Tehran considered worth the external cost? Or do you think it reflects a genuine breakdown in coordination between Iran's military and its own diplomatic negotiators in the middle of an incredibly high-stakes moment? It's also worth asking whether either explanation is really mutually exclusive from the other, since a government juggling active warfare, internal political pressure, and stalled diplomacy simultaneously may not be operating with the kind of unified, single-minded strategy that outside analysts sometimes assume authoritarian regimes possess by default. Let us know what you think. Down in the comments, we read through every one of them, and it genuinely shapes what we dig into in future videos. If this breakdown helped you understand exactly how a handful of hours in April ended up shaping months of continued conflict that followed, do us a favor and hit like on this video, leave your take in the comments, and subscribe if you haven't already, so you catch the next update the moment something shifts. This war keeps producing exactly this kind of consequential, easy to overlook moment, and we'll keep digging into every one of them as they come. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.